Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Before we get started, I wanted to thank all of my supporters on Patreon. Their financial support helps cover the costs associated with hosting and producing the Backyard Ecology podcast and blog. If you would like to join them, you can find out more information on the Backyard Ecology website or by searching for Backyard Ecology on the Patreon website. Today we are talking to Murry Burgess. Murry is an ornithologist, urban ecologist, and children's author. She is also working on her PhD at North Carolina State University, where she is studying the effects of light pollution on barn swallows. Hi, Murry. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thank you for talking with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yes, and I'm really excited to talk with you and have this conversation because it's going to be about something that I don't think a lot of us really think about too often, but it can have pretty significant impacts, what's going on with the animals around us in our yards and in our communities. But before we really get into that too much, can you tell everyone just a little bit about how you got interested in nature and the outdoors?
Yes, so as a little kid, I was always interested in animals. I wanted to go to all the zoos and watch all the nature documentaries, but it wasn't until I almost got into college that I learned that wildlife biology can be an actual career. And once I knew that, my path was all set. I was ready to become a wildlife biologist and study birds and everything that impacts them.
Yes, that sounds very familiar to me too. I always knew I wanted to work with animals. And everybody was like, oh, you want to be a veterinarian? No, I don't want to be a veterinarian. I want to run around and be outside. Yeah. So do you want to be a zookeeper? No, I want to stay outside in the woods, in the fields. And like you said, it wasn't until almost into college that I found out that it was called a wildlife biology degree. And you could do this for real.
Exactly.
Yes. So you've been studying light pollution, which is what we're going to talk about today. How'd you go from wanting to study the animals and everything like that to getting into light pollution specifically?
Yes, so I really wanted to do something that was avian conservation related. And I learned that one of the biggest things impacting birds today is actually sensory pollutants like light and noise. And so that kind of pivoted my research towards the urban ecology and studying really how humans specifically impact birds.
Yeah, it's not something that, like I said, we think about too much, really, is what those impacts are. But as we're all getting interested more and thinking about more the animals in our own backyards, in front yards, and communities, we're starting to think about some of those impacts of light and sound more and more. And so, yes, it's a very important topic for us to be thinking about and to learn more about.
Right, especially as urbanization continues to increase and we develop more natural habitat, we really have to keep in mind and be conscious about how we're impacting the wildlife that lived there before we did.
Yes, I definitely agree. But let's start at the beginning because, like I said, this isn't something that most people think about a lot. Some people may have never even heard of light pollution, going, what are they talking about? So, yeah, let's start there. What is light pollution?
Okay, so light pollution is artificial light that can be seen at night. So any billboards, street lamps, car lights, lights on any buildings, any artificial light source that is present at night is what light pollution is.
Yes. And I read not too long ago, well, actually, it's been a couple of years now, but about a study that was done in 2016 that was saying that like 80% of people in North America can't see the Milky Way from their own yards.
Yeah, I read that same thing too. And yes, 80% of North Americans can't see the Milky Way, which is really sad because the stars are so beautiful at night.
Mhm.
But it's the glow from all the light pollution that kind of creates this blanket in the sky and blocks out the stars.
Yes. And you don't even realize it a lot of times or how prevalent it is. I mean, most of my life, I've lived not in town, but not full on out in the middle of nowhere rural either, just kind of that in between area. So I could
Mhm.
see the Milky Way, but there was always that glow on the horizon that I knew was the city lights. But still, I could see the Milky Way. I thought I was seeing some pretty cool stars a lot of times. And then a few years ago, my mother and I took a vacation out west and we were driving to all the parks in Utah. And oh my gosh, it's just a completely different world out there than it is here in the Eastern US. I mean, it's just amazing because some of the places that we went, if we were driving at night, our headlights were the only lights that we would see for hours, except for the stars and the moon. And it was just night and day difference between what you saw out there and what I saw from my own yard, or whether it was my mother's yard, which is where I grew up, or my current yard. I mean, it's just amazing.
Right. I've never lived in like a super big city either, always like the suburbs. And it's like,
Mhm.
oh, you can see a little bit of the sky, a little bit of the stars. But that's the thing that people really don't think about with light pollution, that even if you aren't in the big cities, right where the biggest sources of light pollution are, they can still spread out even to adjacent areas and all across the sky into smaller cities and towns, suburban, sometimes even rural environments, depending on where you are.
And I mean, that's going to be more prevalent here in the Eastern US than it
Right,
is out West, just because there's more people living in the Eastern US than there is in the West.
right, exactly.
So we've talked about some of the sources of light pollution. You mentioned that at the beginning. The really anything can be light pollution. That's got the light at night.
Right. And the most common source are the street lamps along roads and in neighborhoods.
And we're not saying that we should get rid of them all either. I mean, it's our built environments. We need some of those lights for safety and stuff, but there's a balance in there.
Exactly. Some light is necessary for us, but it doesn't have to be constantly on all the time. And there are different forms of light pollution that we can talk about and what's better, what's worse, and everything like that.
Well, why don't you go ahead and share with us some of those?
Okay, so of course, the best thing to do to solve light pollution is to turn off the lights. And that's not always possible everywhere or for everybody. Like myself, I live in an apartment complex, so I don't control the outdoor lights. But if you can't turn them off, you can at least change the type of lights that are being used. For example, LED lights are better than regular incandescent bulbs. They give off less heat and they're just like more eco friendly and energy friendly. And also, if you can change the color of your lights, that's really helpful. Instead of the bright white lights or the blue lights, a softer red, orange, or yellow light is less harmful than the other forms.
Yeah. And I mean, even with the street lights, you and I, we can't do much with those. But
Right.
there are other forms of, there's like shielding and non-shield, and there's certain types of lights and designs that also will help direct the light down to the ground where we need it and not necessarily let it all go up into the sky, which is also an economic thing because we don't have to pay for as much light that we're wasting up. We're just doing this. I always think of my mother telling me to inside or outside, stop running in and out. I'm not paying to heat or cool, whichever season it is, the outside. My grandmother too. She told
Exactly.
me that a lot.
Exactly. And yes, the same principle is true with our lights. The best thing you can do is kind of enclose the lights on all sides except for where it's pointing straight down to the area that actually you want to be illuminated. And that kind of design will help reduce that overall blanket sky glow, which is really helpful for us to enjoy some more stars and also helpful for wildlife, especially birds who rely on the stars to migrate and find their way.
Yes. And that's one of the things I wanted to talk about is, okay, who cares? Why should we care? What are these effects? Because until you really start digging deep and thinking about it, they're not always obvious, or at least they weren't to me when I first started learning about light pollution.
Mm-hmm. So light pollution affects every living organism, humans, plants and animals, all different types of wildlife. And a lot of the effects are actually pretty much the same, no matter which species we're talking about. The most prevalent impact is just not getting a good night's sleep. And I know we all want our good night's sleep when we're
Yes.
tired at the end of the day. We want nothing more than to lay down and go right to sleep. But the light pollution suppresses melatonin. And I think we've all heard of melatonin, like you might take a melatonin pill to help you go to sleep. The body naturally produces melatonin. But what light pollution does is suppress that production. And so your body isn't getting the signals that you're sleepy or to help you fall asleep.
Yeah, I'm one of those people that's pretty sensitive to light. I wake up with the sun. So I don't like to sleep in super late, and I don't like to get up before the sun. I like to get up with the sun. So my wake up time varies throughout the year, just as the sun gets up earlier. Is needing to have it dark at night, but then still being able to wake up with the sun as it gets light.
Right. Yes. And that's what a lot of wildlife relies on. And of course, if it's just bright all night with artificial light, those cues get thrown off.
Mm-hmm.
And that affects a lot of things further down the line, like reproduction and the way the body metabolizes food and navigation, and just so many other things that can be affected from not getting a good night's sleep, which I'm sure we've all had experience with.
Yes, definitely. And like you said, some of our birds migrate by the moon and the stars. And that's even birds that we think of as being diurnal, so active during the day. Some of them are migrating at night.
Right. And they are relying on the moonlight or the stars. And if light pollution is in the way, that can disorient them. And flight is so energetically expensive anyway, so they want to get where they're going as quickly and as safely as possible. In fact, I think it's 1 billion birds every single year are killed because of building collisions. The light, they get disoriented and they accidentally fly into a building instead of where they were trying to go based on the stars.
Yeah, I've read that too. And that number always amazes me. That's
Mm-hmm.
so high.
It is.
And even the insects. I mean, I think we've all experienced having the porch light on and all the bugs that come to the porch light, or standing in a park at night and having those big street lights on and watching everything going to the big street lights. I mean, the insects too are drawn to those lights because no longer is the moon the brightest object in the sky. It's the lights that we're putting out there.
Right. Insects need their sleep too.
Mm-hmm.
And also, if they're out being attracted to the lights, other predators are able to pick them off easier.
Yes. When you're in the middle of town, sometimes the streetlights are the best places to see things like nighthawks and bats because they're drawn to where the bugs are being drawn to.
Right. Easy food source.
Mm-hmm. And then there's other insects that I've read that will avoid those really bright lights. And so it's causing indirect effects too in that way, because if you don't have as many insects or the same types of insects, then that's a food source for the birds that we're thinking about more, like our songbirds and stuff.
Right. Even if a species isn't directly impacted by lights, all of these animals are connected in some type of way. And if something is affecting one animal directly, all the rest of the animals are subsequently affected.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something that we do a lot of times is we'll focus on one animal or one group of animals, and we forget how everything else is tied together. So everything that they rely on and everything that relies on them further up the food chain, or just indirectly, even if they're not direct predators of each other, but still, I think we all fall into that trap sometimes.
Right.
So I know you've been doing a lot of research with birds and light pollution. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my research, I study species as barn swallows. And what I'm looking at is more how light pollution affects them on an internal level. So I'm looking at their metabolic health and looking at barn swallow chicks specifically to see how they grow in artificial light versus natural conditions.
And I know you haven't published yet, but can you give us an idea of kind of generally, are they the same? Are they different? What's generally going on here?
So I have 2 field seasons worth of data so far. My third one is starting next month, actually. And based on the first 2 years of data, we are seeing that barn swallow chicks that grow up in the light end up smaller than the birds in natural conditions. They grow slower and they end up smaller as adults.
Any ideas as to why? I mean, is it just direct fewer insects, or is it that not getting a good night's sleep, or can we not tell? Or
Yeah, so the hypothesis is for right now, so under normal conditions, the chick is getting fed by the mom throughout the day. And when the chick goes to sleep at night, the energy they get from that food is being converted into proteins. And proteins are the super important part because they help build the chick's body and their muscles and gets them ready to fly and everything. And so that cycle is broken a little bit by light pollution, because if the chick isn't getting enough sleep or is expending more energy, like staying awake, they're making less proteins, which means their bodies end up smaller and they take a little bit longer to develop.
that makes a lot of sense, especially when you start thinking about the physiology of how all this works together and how the body does grow, which is almost always while you're asleep.
Right.
And I know this is kind of speculating a bit, but do we think that these results are likely to be similar for other species of birds?
I definitely think so. I have seen other studies with tree swallows, chickadees, bluebirds, and they're all finding, if not similar results, like other physiological differences between chicks in the light versus natural darkness at night, whether that be like feather growth or ending up smaller or taking longer to leave the nest.
Yeah, and all of those things can really have significant impacts later on in life.
Right.
Because, I mean, barn swallows are migratory. Many of these species that we're talking about are migratory. And so if it's taking them longer to develop, then they may not be as strong or as well developed when it comes time to migrate. So that can have significant impacts there.
Exactly. And if they're not able to fly or migrate on time, then they're missing out on those food sources that they find as they migrate. And so just like the timing of the seasons and the food and the growth and everything gets thrown off just by that one instance of light pollution.
Mm-hmm. And I would think that if they're growing slower and developing slower, then that might also impact the number of broods that the adults can have throughout the year, because many of our songbirds will have 2 broods a year, especially, say, mid-continent south. I mean, once as you go further north and their growing season's shorter, so they may only have 1 brood season, but for many of us, there's 2 brood seasons. So they're trying to raise potentially 2 sets of chicks each year.
And that's true as well. A lot of the barn swallows that I work with, they try to lay 3 times in the barn, but a lot of the nests that are in the light pollution don't make it that far, because they're taking a long time to raise that first one and maybe get to a second one. And of course, that's also like way more taxing on the parents too, to have to take care of chicks that are not independent, keep feeding them, keep watching them until they can fly and kind of fend for themselves a little bit.
Yeah. So is it primarily just slower growth, or are we seeing other conditions too that might also be impacting other nutritional things, or have you not looked at that?
So I have also been testing blood sugar levels with my barn swallows, and it seems a little bit that there is a trend that the birds in the light pollution are having like higher blood sugar than the birds in natural conditions. We're not sure what this is due to. Maybe they just haven't been able to convert what's already in their bodies into other nutrients. Or maybe their parents are feeding them more because there's light and there's bugs and go ahead and eat while it's there. So we're not sure of that cause yet, but there's a trend there.
Which brings up an interesting thought, because yeah, there's light, there's bugs. We can catch them. Let's feed them. You would almost think that they would grow faster because there's more food source, but that's not what you're seeing.
Right. You would think it'd be an advantage.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it really does come down to the protein. If you're using that food energy to be up all the time, then you're not able to convert it into proteins and other necessary things to actually grow.
Yeah, that makes sense when you say it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember I was high school, probably, may have even been in college and just home for a visit in the summer. But I remember there was always wrens that would nest on the front porch, and they had a motion detecting light on. And there was this one year that we laughed so hard because periodically throughout the night, the light would come on. We'd be sitting in the living room, curtains drawn, but you could still see the light come on sometimes. And at first we're like, huh? And we kind of look out the window, see what's going on. And finally we figure out what it was. That wren was flying through the light, turning the light on, and it kind of sit there for a few minutes until the bugs came, grab a bug, and then go back to the nest. And it was so hilarious to watch.
Wow, wrens are so smart. They're one of my favorite birds.
Yes, mine too. But yeah, I mean, you would think that could be a good thing, but as studies like yours are finding, that not so much the truth.
Right, not always beneficial.
So what are some of the interesting things that you've observed with your studies?
So I have seen that there might also be a bit of a egg production factor as well. I know a lot of poultry and like domestic bird studies have been done with like light and egg laying rates.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm seeing with my wild birds is that they might produce less eggs in the light. Not sure why that is yet. Still have a lot of research and looking in to do to that. But it's just these interesting little things that are happening between the different groups. Less eggs, the smaller chicks, less broods overall, high blood sugar. It doesn't sound that great for the barn swallow population.
No, it definitely doesn't. And like we said, this is something that I think people are only just now, and people being scientists as well as the public are really only within the last few decades starting to recognize and really start to look into the impacts.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you really think about it, light pollution is still kind of a new thing. We haven't had like all this industry and urbanization for too many decades. And so it's just now catching on as a popular topic in urban ecology.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, urban ecology itself is still a relatively new field. Yeah, I don't think we were even talking urban ecology when I was in college. And I'm not that old. Or at least I don't feel like I'm that old.
Yeah, and urban ecology wasn't even something I was initially thinking of when I wanted to be a biologist. I thought of it as just like, oh, there's a bear in my trash can, and that's about it. Like, how do you keep wildlife out of urban areas? But that's really not the case. It's really about learning how to make cities more sustainable and eco-friendly and live together with the wildlife.
Right. And I think that's something that we're also still just figuring out, is that there is wildlife in our cities and our towns. And it's not all way far out there in the pristine wilderness areas.
Right. There's wildlife all around you. And even though it might be common, something you see every single day, it's still valuable. You still want to keep common species common.
Right. And there's a lot we don't know about the common species. And it's amazing how quickly common species can become not common.
Exactly.
I mean, I worked at Mammoth Cave National Park for a while, and that was right when white nose syndrome was starting to spread through the bats. So I heard a lot about it and was really learning a lot about that just firsthand. And so many of our most common bat species in the East, just 30 years ago, 20 years ago, some of them are our rarest species now. And there's so much that scientists are saying, we wish we had known, but nobody bothered to study them because they were common. They would always be there.
Right. And just everything changes so fast due to the nature of how humans are. But nature doesn't always change that fast, and they can't keep up with us. And so that's where a lot of these impacts are happening with common species becoming not common. They just simply can't keep up.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we're talking about light pollution and birds specifically, but if you live on the coast where there's sea turtles, I mean, that's a big thing there. I mean, it really impacts all levels of animals, I think, in different ways perhaps, but it's still the same basic thing.
Yeah, most definitely.
And then, like you said, we're changing so quickly and our technology is changing so quickly. I mean, just down the road from me, they just within the last few years put up a digital billboard, which definitely has a lot more light glowing off of it than the old fashioned billboards with just a little incandescent lights kind of shining down on it.
Yeah, that is, they invent newer, fancier ways of light pollution all the time. Just like, that is so cool, but like maybe turn it off for a few hours at night. That's really, really helpful, especially during migration seasons. Just having like a curfew where all non-essential lights are turned off for a few hours at night can be a great way to help a lot of species.
But I mean, again, that's something that we as individuals really can't do. But there are things that we can do. Like if you own your home, instead of leaving the lights on in the porch all the time, put in a motion detector light.
Right.
That way the light's there when you need it. You're not creating safety issues, but you're also not lighting up the whole entire yard when you don't need to.
Right. Motion detector lights are a great method. Also, we talked about like encasing the lights and pointing them directly at what we want to illuminate. So it's not just one solution. It's going to take all of these solutions together, both on an individual level and like a big policy change level to kind of mitigate some of the light pollution.
Yeah, but there are little things that we can all do. I mean, curtains, just pulling the curtains. And I'm not perfect about pulling my curtains because I'm in the country. But yeah, just pulling the curtains can make a big difference sometimes.
And I have blackout curtains, which I bought them for me because I don't like a whole lot of light when I sleep, but it works the other way around too. The light doesn't escape out of the room into the open wildlife areas.
Yes. And I mean, I did an episode about a year ago now on fireflies. And Lynn, who was the person I was talking to about fireflies, she does a lot of firefly research and works with National Geographic and some of their filming crews and stuff like that. And they were filming around her house a few years ago. So since they were working at night, she didn't have the lights on in the house. And she was amazed by just the difference between not having the lights on in the house because she lives out in the middle of nowhere and doesn't have the curtains on her house, and the number of fireflies and lightning bugs that were in her yard and the diversity just by turning the lights off for a few nights because they were doing the filming there.
Yeah, it's so simple yet so effective. And that's one of the great things about what I study. Like the solution is actually simple for once.
Yes, that is always helpful when you have a solution that you can actually do something about, and that is simple.
Yes, it's like everybody has the power to flip a switch. And that's what's great about my research. Like the impacts are very clear and the solutions are very clear. It's just a matter of getting it done.
Yes, which can also be challenging sometimes.
Yeah, especially like on those bigger scales when you're in the city and you don't have control over just your house or just your porch. So that's where it really, really matters on the broad level.
Yeah, that's where, like you said, it does get challenging and frustrating sometimes because we can't do something about everything. I mean, there's so many things that, like you said, the larger scale issues that we have no direct control over. But I think education and just being aware is a good start because there's no chance of changing anything if we don't know about the issues or aren't aware and don't care about the effects of it.
Right. That's always the first step. That's also why I try to do a lot of education and science communication just to get the word out there. It's a lot of people just haven't heard of it, just like I hadn't heard of it like 4 years ago.
Yeah, I don't remember how I ran into light pollution, but it was not something that we studied in college or that I heard about growing up. or anything like that. Nobody even thought about it or talked about it.
And hopefully, like in another 10 years, it can be a common topic and people will be more conscious of it and be inventing new types of lights and ways to minimize the light pollution.
Yeah, hopefully. And I think there's a good chance of it. I mean, I know a lot more people are talking about it and are aware of it today than were 10 years ago. So we're on the right track.
We are.
Well, you said that you like to do a lot of education. And that was one of the reasons why I really wanted to talk to you today, too, because, I mean, obviously, education is a big part of what I like to do as well. And I see that as being very important. Tell us a little bit about that if you want.
Yeah, so I do various different things. I try to talk at least once a month to a children's audience. Usually they're like middle school or like early high school students about birds and conservation and what light pollution is and what they can do to solve it, just to like spread the word out there and help to inspire, the next generation of naturalists and scientists. I love doing that so much. I am also a children's author. I have a book coming out in 2024. It is about a little girl who goes around her suburban neighborhood and teaches people how to identify different types of birds.
Oh, nice. That's really great because, like we were saying before, so often we forget that there's some really cool birds in the cities.
There are. And it's like sometimes we tend to ignore things that are common because you see it all the time. You don't really put much value onto it. But it's worth putting value onto because you never know, like we said, when they might become uncommon.
Right. And I can't imagine not having the Carolina wrens waking me up every morning or listening to them just periodically throughout the day, or not having fireflies or anything like that. I mean, there's some things that are very common that are just, they're part of my life. I just can't imagine them not being there.
Yeah, and learning about them and appreciating them, especially in my own life, was just like the catalyst into me going into this conservation field and wanting to do something about them.
And I think what you're doing with working with the younger people and the next generation and writing children's books that show the kids from the very beginning that, yeah, we can appreciate and enjoy what's in our own yards and communities, as well as what's out in the wilder, more natural areas. I think that's really important because, I mean, for a long time, and people who listen to this podcast have probably heard me say this before, for a very, very long time, I thought you always had to go somewhere to enjoy nature and the outdoors. And it was a process for me to really start to appreciate just all those common things, like I said, that I see all the time in the nature that is closer to home, that we can enjoy every single day, and that it is just as important as everything that's further out there that's in those wilder areas.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I used to have a similar mindset as well. Like, I need to go out to this national park or this refuge in order to experience wildlife. But looking back, like wildlife has always been around me in my backyard, in my neighborhoods, or at school. And I really enjoyed those interactions, especially as a little kid trying to catch lizards and butterflies and things. And those experiences are really what drove me. So wildlife is everywhere. You just have to like look for it and learn to appreciate it, and everything will be great.
Yes, exactly. And it's so ironic because I'm the same as you. I mean, it was running around in the cow pasture next door and flushing out the quail and catching tadpoles in the pond and bringing home the pond water to look under the microscope and chasing butterflies and lizards and you name it. And that's what got me interested and really propelled me into the field of wildlife biology. And then we turn our backs on and says, okay, that's not the important stuff. Let's go somewhere else. And it's like, wait a minute, we've got two mindsets there that don't work together.
Exactly. Especially like thinking like, oh, it's the lions and tigers that I see on TV,
Yes.
like these other countries' animals. And just having to remember that like the animals that we see here in America, here in these suburban urban environments are also important. just like lions and tigers.
Yes, exactly. And the people in the other countries are looking at ours and going, oh, that's the cool, fun stuff. I mean,
Right. It's like you don't even think about that part.
yes, exactly. Well, I know you write a blog too. Can you tell us a little bit about it? Because I mean, I'm always up for sharing resources and other things that people might enjoy learning about and ways to learn.
Yeah, so my blog, I started it late last year, is called Not a Snake Doctor. And it's called that because I'm sure just like all of us, you have family members that don't entirely understand what you do. Like I do something with animals. I'm not quite a veterinarian. So it's like
Mhm.
not a snake doctor is where that title comes from. And on that blog, I just share like my experiences about like what it's like to be a wildlife biologist. Just everyday stories. It doesn't have to be like super grand or important because a lot of our day-to-day work isn't like that. So just being realistic on that blog and like sharing some of my experiences, whether they be like happy or scary, exciting, boring, just wanting to put an example out there, especially as a Black woman who is doing this work, because you don't really see a whole lot of people of color in the natural science professions.
Yes, exactly. I think that is so important to show all the different, like you said, the happy parts, the sad parts, the days when you have great discoveries and the days when it's, oh crap, what just happened? Yeah.
Right.
And then to have all the different voices out there and show that this is something everybody can do.
Exactly. One of the stories that I love sharing all the time is that a snake eats my research. A snake likes to come into the barn where I work and like predate the chicks. And it's like you had all these measurements set up that you were going to do in this whole plan. And come to find out, the nest is empty and a snake has a full belly somewhere. And it's just so sad.
And I'm having this picture, I'm sure this is what you were going for, of you going to your research professor and giving the my dog ate my homework excuse as my
Yes.
snake ate the snake ate my homework.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. Oh, I was so mad. I was like, no, you ate the chicks. I'm trying to get a degree here.
Yes. Eat the chicks next year after I graduate.
Yes.
Oh, yes, I completely get that. And it's not like you can just restart the experiment because it's all on the bird's time frame.
It all depends on the birds. I can't just go get new chicks when I need them.
Yes.
And that's a lot of things that people don't think about, a lot of those issues that go into wildlife research.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's a one-shot deal. And if whatever happens during the season, if the birds only nest one time, because some species only do nest one time a year, or with fireflies, you've got a very few weeks to get the data. And same thing with some of our native bees. You may have only a few weeks and one shot. And if you miss it, then you're looking at another year to do the research and to find that out because we're working on the natural schedule here. We can't just go buy new chicks.
Exactly. I always say that like the birds have my schedule from like April to June. Like I can't tell you when I'll be able to do something. It depends on the birds.
Yeah, exactly. Which depends partially on the weather and depends on, I mean, so many different factors out there.
Definitely have to be flexible and able to roll with the punches when you're doing research, field research.
Yeah, I love field research, but there's times where it's just like, oh, come on.
Yeah.
But we get to be outside and we get to work with the critters and the animals that, I mean, we both love. And that's what drove us into this field.
Right, exactly. And that's absolutely my favorite part, just getting to like hold the chicks and see how tiny they are. It blows my mind every single year just how tiny these little birds start off.
Oh, yes. And then within a few weeks, they're flying around. And
Right, it's incredible.
yes, this has been really interesting. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
So, if people want to learn more about your research, have questions about light pollution, maybe we have teachers who would like to have somebody talk to their class or something like that, can people get in touch with you?
Oh, absolutely. You can get in touch with me through my website. It's mlburgess.org. Or you can also follow me on social media, Instagram and Twitter at Murry, Loub. And of course, follow my blog, notasnake.doctor.squarespace.com. And I'll show you a link, all of that in the show notes.
Oh, yes. I was going to say, nobody panic here. I'm going to have it all in the show notes. Go to the show notes and there'll be links that you can just click. You don't have to try and scribble it down while you're driving or whatever you're doing, because if you're like me, you're usually doing something else as you're listening to podcasts.
Yes, the same. But yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out. I am so happy to answer questions or talk to your class or do a workshop for you.
Thank you so much. This has been, like I said, really fun.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
I appreciate Murry taking the time to talk with us. Light pollution is one of those topics that we may not hear about very often, but its impacts can be pretty widespread and significant. You heard us talking about some of those effects, and the more we study light pollution, the greater the number and types of impacts that we are finding. The good news is that this is an issue that we can do something about. The solutions really aren't that complicated, especially when compared to some of the other environmental issues that we face. Most of us will probably be working at the individual scale of doing things like changing out the lights around our homes or drawing the curtains at night. But some people may be in a position to make some of those larger scale changes related to streetlights and lights around a large building or things like that. And when it comes time to replace the lights at the local county park or a new road is being built, then maybe choosing a style of light which minimizes light pollution is a concern that can be raised during the planning stages. We can all do something, and all those little things can add up. I also really enjoyed just sharing stories and chatting with Murry. It's ironic that so many of us were inspired to go into this field by the wildlife and nature around us. But then we also thought that you had to go somewhere else to enjoy or study nature. That's one of the reasons why I think urban ecology is so important, because it helps to remind us that wildlife and nature can be found in our built environments too, and that is just as worthy of studying. I'm grateful to researchers and educators like Murry who are doing the research and then turning around and sharing it with everyone around them. Before I wrap this up, I wanted to let you know about my email list. Every week I send a short email with links to the most recent Backyard Ecology blog article and podcast episode, as well as any other news of interest. It's the best way to make sure that you never miss anything in the backyard ecology world. If you haven't signed up, then I encourage you to do so at www.backyardecology.net/subscribe. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.